I'm Josephine Thornton, 34, a Navy SEAL officer who earned her post the long way, training, deployments, and leading people who count on me. For years, I bent over backward for the man I loved and the family I hoped to join. But when, in our own chapel, my in-laws laughed and called me not worthy, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been dismissed or humiliated by people you've given everything to? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into it, drop where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being wronged, tap like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and quiet strength. What happened next might surprise you. The first time Richard's mother made that face, the one where her lips pursed like she'd bitten into something sour, I was standing in their kitchen wearing my dress blues. It was Thanksgiving, 6 months before the wedding, and I'd come straight from base. The uniform was pristine, ribbons aligned perfectly, but Margaret Thornton looked at me like I'd tracked mud across her Persian rug. "Oh," she said, not quite hiding her disappointment. "You're still in that." Richard squeezed my shoulder. "Mom, Josephine just got promoted. Lieutenant commander now." "How nice." The words came out flat, dismissive. She turned back to her stuffing preparation, effectively ending the conversation. His father, Thomas, glanced up from his newspaper just long enough to nod before returning to the sports section. No congratulations. No questions about my service. Nothing. I should have recognized the pattern then, but I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they needed time to adjust to having a military officer in the family. Maybe they weren't sure how to relate to someone whose life looked so different from theirs. The comments started small. At Christmas dinner, Margaret mentioned how challenging it must be for Richard to have a girlfriend who was never around. When I explained my deployment schedule, she sighed dramatically and said something about how military wives usually understood these things better than military husbands. I corrected her gently. "Actually, Mrs. Thornton, Richard's been incredibly supportive. And I'm the one in the military, not him." She blinked as if she'd forgotten. "Oh yes, of course." But the slip felt intentional. Like she couldn't quite process that I was the one with the demanding career, the one who'd earned my position through years of training and service. At Richard's birthday party in March, I overheard his aunt whispering to Margaret near the powder room. "She seems intense. Are you sure she's the right fit for our Richard?" "We're hoping it's a phase," Margaret replied, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch it. "He's always been attracted to unusual women." Unusual. The word sat heavy in my chest. I'd spent the evening making polite conversation with their friends, discussing their book club selections and vacation plans to Martha's Vineyard. I'd asked thoughtful questions about their children's college experiences and complimented Margaret's flower arrangements. But somehow I was still unusual. Richard found me on their back terrace a few minutes later. "You okay? You seem quiet." I could have told him what I'd heard, but I didn't want to force him to choose sides at his own birthday party. "Just tired. Long week at base." He pulled me close, and I breathed in his familiar scent, soap and coffee and something distinctly him. "They'll come around," he said quietly. "They just need time." But time didn't help. If anything, the subtle digs became more frequent. At the engagement party they hosted, Margaret introduced me to their neighbors as Richard's fiancée, the one in the Navy. Not by name, not by rank. Just the one in the Navy, like I was a curiosity rather than a person. When the talk turned to wedding planning, she took over with the enthusiasm of a general commanding troops. "We'll need to be careful about the guest list," she announced, flipping through her leather-bound planner. "Some of our friends might not be comfortable with, well, you know." "With what?" I asked. "Military people can be so intense at social gatherings." Richard shifted beside me. "Mom, Josephine's friends are great. You'd like them." "I'm sure they're lovely," Margaret said with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "But perhaps it would be better to keep things traditional. Our circle expects a certain tone." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I got when facing hostile terrain or impossible odds. But this wasn't combat. This was supposed to be family. The final straw came during the rehearsal dinner. I was seated at the family table, wearing a simple black dress that cost more than my monthly utilities bill. I'd chosen it specifically to fit in, to avoid giving them any reason to find fault. Margaret's sister, Patricia, had too much wine and decided to share her thoughts about modern women. "It's just so hard for men these days," she said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "Having to compete with women who think they need to prove something." "I don't think Josephine's trying to prove anything," Richard said carefully. "Oh, but she is," Patricia continued, emboldened by the alcohol and the murmurs of agreement around the table. "All this military business, it's just not natural. Women are supposed to support their husbands, not overshadow them." The table went quiet. I felt every eye on me, waiting for my response. Part of me wanted to explain that I'd joined the Navy because I believed in service, in protecting something bigger than myself. That my career wasn't about proving anything to anyone, it was about dedication and honor and the satisfaction of earning respect through competence and courage. Instead, I took a sip of water and said, "I love what I do." "Well," Patricia said with a little laugh, "hopefully that will change after the wedding." Margaret nodded approvingly. Marriage does tend to shift priorities. Richard's hand found mine under the table, his fingers intertwining with mine in what I hoped was solidarity. But when I looked at his face, I saw conflict there, love for me warring with his lifelong habit of avoiding confrontation with his family. That night, in our hotel room, I stared at the ceiling while Richard slept beside me. Tomorrow was our wedding day, and I should have been excited. Instead, I felt like I was preparing for battle with people who were supposed to become my family. "They don't respect me," I said quietly to the darkness. Richard stirred. "What?" "Your parents. They don't respect who I am or what I've accomplished. They see my career as something I'll eventually outgrow, like a rebellious phase." He rolled toward me, his face soft with sleep and concern. "Give them time, Josephine. Once they see how happy we are, time won't fix this," I interrupted. "They've already decided who I am. And tomorrow, they're going to make sure everyone else knows it too." He was quiet for a long moment. "Then, I'll talk to them." But I'd heard that promise before, and I'd seen how those conversations went. Richard would speak to them privately, they'd offer vague reassurances, and nothing would change. The pattern was too established, the dynamic too comfortable for them to disrupt. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on tomorrow, on the vows we'd written, on the life we'd planned together. But underneath the anticipation was a growing certainty that something fundamental would have to shift. I just didn't know what yet. The morning of our wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that makes everything seem possible. I stood in the chapel's bridal suite, adjusting my dress and watching sunlight stream through stained glass windows. In a few hours, Richard and I would be married. In a few hours, I'd officially become part of the Thornton family. The thought should have filled me with joy. Instead, it felt like walking into an ambush. Margaret knocked and entered without waiting for permission. She wore a navy dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her hair styled in the same elegant chignon she'd worn to every family event I'd attended. "How are you feeling, dear?" she asked, but her tone suggested she was asking out of obligation rather than genuine concern. "Good. Ready." She moved to the window, her back to me. "I hope you understand that today is very important to us. The Thorntons have a certain reputation in this community." There it was, the warning wrapped in maternal concern. I'd been expecting it, but hearing it out loud still stung. "I understand," I said carefully. "Good." She turned back to me with that brittle smile. "I'm sure you'll do your best to fit in." After she left, I sat alone in the quiet room, my hands folded in my lap. The dress was beautiful, ivory silk with delicate beading, traditional and elegant. It was the kind of dress a proper Thornton bride would wear. But as I looked at myself in the mirror, I wondered if I was disappearing into someone else's idea of who I should be. 20 minutes before the ceremony, I made my way to the chapel. The space was stunning, high ceilings, carved wooden pews, flowers arranged in perfect symmetry. Richard's family filled the left side, a sea of expensive suits and understated jewelry. My side was sparser. My parents had flown in from Oregon, and a few friends from my college days. My teammates couldn't make it, they were deployed overseas. I took my place in the back pew as we'd rehearsed. The plan was for me to walk down the aisle alone, My father had passed away 3 years earlier, and I'd chosen to honor his memory by walking solo rather than asking someone else to give me away. But as the music began and conversations continued around me, I realized something was wrong. The whispers from Richard's side weren't the usual pre-ceremony chatter. They were pointed, deliberate. "She looks nice enough," someone murmured, "but you have to wonder about her background. Military women are so hard. Richard needs someone softer. I heard she outranks most men on her base. That can't be healthy for a marriage." The comments washed over me like a tide, each one designed to diminish, to question, to undermine. But it was Margaret's voice that cut deepest. "Honestly," she said to the woman beside her, her voice carrying perfectly in the acoustics of the chapel, "she's just not worthy of our son." The laughter that followed was polite, restrained, but unmistakable. A dozen people, Richard's aunts, his parents' friends, family members I'd tried so hard to win over, all nodding in agreement. Not worthy. I sat frozen in the pew, the words echoing in my head. Around me, the laughter continued, soft and cruel. These people didn't see my years of service, my leadership of sailors who trusted me with their lives, my dedication to something larger than myself. They saw a woman who didn't fit their narrow definition of appropriate. The organist began the processional, and I knew I was supposed to stand, to begin my walk down that aisle. But for a moment, I couldn't move. The weight of their judgment, their dismissal, their absolute certainty that I wasn't good enough, it pressed down on me like water at crushing depth. Then I thought about my team. My sailors. The men and women who'd served under my command, who'd trusted my decisions in situations where lives hung in the balance. They'd never questioned my worth. They'd seen me prove it, day after day, through competence and courage and unwavering commitment to the mission. I stood up slowly, my spine straight, my shoulders back. Let them think I wasn't worthy. I knew better. And soon, they would too. The chapel doors opened behind me, and I heard the sound that would change everything, the sharp, rhythmic percussion of combat boots on stone floor. Growing up in a military family, you learn early that some battles choose you. My mother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's knowing what's worth fighting for despite the fear. I'd carried that lesson through Naval Academy, through SEAL training, through deployments where lives depended on split-second decisions. But nothing had prepared me for the particular brand of warfare that happens in civilian spaces, where the weapons are words and the casualties are dignity and self-worth. My path to the teams wasn't typical. Most people assume SEAL officers are men who grew up dreaming of combat, who played war games as children and counted down the days until they could enlist. My story was different. I'd wanted to be a marine biologist, actually spent my high school years volunteering at aquariums and planning a career studying coral reefs. The Navy found me during my sophomore year at Stanford. A recruiter spoke to my oceanography class about naval research opportunities, and something clicked. Not the combat aspect, that came later, but the idea of service, of being part of something that mattered beyond my own ambitions. Officer candidate school was a shock. 12 weeks of having every assumption about yourself systematically dismantled and rebuilt. I learned to lead sailors who were older and more experienced than me, to make decisions under pressure, to accept responsibility for outcomes I couldn't always control. SEAL training was different. More brutal, more comprehensive, designed to break you in ways you didn't know you could be broken. Of the 18 officers who started with me, 6 graduated. The rest rang the bell, 3 simple words that ended their dreams. I quit, instructor. I never came close to ringing that bell, but not because I was tougher than the others. I just understood something they didn't. Quitting was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not because of pride or ambition, but because I'd made a promise to myself and to the people who would serve under my command. They deserved a leader who had pushed through every possible breaking point and emerged intact. My first deployment was to Afghanistan, leading a mixed team of experienced operators on reconnaissance missions. They tested me constantly those first few months, not maliciously, but thoroughly. They needed to know I could keep up physically, think clearly under stress, and make decisions that would keep them alive. The moment I earned their trust came during an extraction that went sideways. We were pulling a high-value asset out of a compromised location when everything that could go wrong did. Our primary exfil point was blown, our communications were jammed, and we had hostiles closing in from 3 directions. I had about 30 seconds to choose between 2 terrible options: fight our way through superior numbers to a secondary extraction point, or hold position and hope for backup that might not come. Either choice could get my team killed. I chose to fight. Not because it was the safe option. There was no safe option, but because I'd trained with these men, studied their capabilities, and trusted their professionalism. We moved as one unit through hostile territory, covering each other's movements, communicating through hand signals and shared understanding. When we reached the exfil point, my senior chief pulled me aside. "Ma'am," he said, "I wasn't sure about you when we started this deployment." I waited. "I'm sure now." That was the beginning of everything that mattered in my military career. Not the promotions or the decorations, but the knowledge that the people I led trusted my judgment when it counted most. Richard entered my life during my second deployment cycle, when I was stationed in San Diego between overseas rotations. We met at a coffee shop near the base. He was there reading a legal brief. I was there trying to decompress after a particularly brutal training evolution. He didn't know I was military at first. I was wearing civilian clothes, my hair down, looking probably as normal as I ever looked. He asked about the book I was reading, a biography of Admiral Nimitz, and we ended up talking for 3 hours about leadership, responsibility, and what it means to dedicate your life to something larger than yourself. What struck me about Richard wasn't that he was impressed by my career. Plenty of men are attracted to the novelty of dating a female SEAL officer. What struck me was that he understood the weight of it. He asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of command, about how I balance the demands of the job with everything else in life. "It must be lonely sometimes," he said during one of our early conversations. "Making decisions that affect other people's lives." "It is," I admitted. "But it's also the most meaningful work I've ever done." He nodded like he genuinely understood. Later, I'd learned that his work as a public defender gave him his own experience with high-stakes responsibility, with making decisions that could change someone's entire future. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully. He understood that my schedule was unpredictable, that I might disappear for months at a time with minimal communication. He never made me feel guilty about the demands of my career or pressured me to choose between my commitment to the teams and my commitment to him. When I got promoted to lieutenant commander, he was the first person I called. When my team earned a unit citation for a classified operation I couldn't discuss, he took me to dinner and toasted, "Whatever you did that you can't tell me about." The integration with his family was more complicated. The Thorntons inhabited a world where careers were important but secondary to social standing, where success was measured by the right schools, the right neighborhoods, the right connections. My dedication to the military didn't translate into their framework of achievement. But my team understood perfectly. These were people who'd served in every corner of the globe, who'd seen combat in environments most civilians couldn't imagine. They knew what it meant to earn respect through competence, to lead through example rather than entitlement. Master Chief Rodriguez, my senior enlisted, had been with the teams for 15 years when I took command. He could have resented being led by someone younger, less experienced, female. Instead, he became one of my strongest advocates. The thing about the commander, I heard him tell a new guy once, is she doesn't ask us to do anything she wouldn't do herself. And she doesn't make decisions based on what looks good in a report. She makes them based on what gets us home. That was the culture I lived in for most of my adult life, a place where respect was earned through demonstrated confidence, where your worth was measured by your willingness to serve something larger than yourself, where trust was built through shared risk and mutual dependence. The contrast with the Thornton family dynamic was jarring. Their approval seemed to depend on factors I couldn't control: my background, my career choice, my failure to fit their predetermined idea of who Richard should marry. But as I sat in that chapel, listening to their dismissive laughter, something shifted in my perspective. I'd spent months trying to earn their acceptance, adjusting my behavior and appearance to meet their expectations. I'd been fighting the wrong battle entirely. The sound of boots on stone reminded me who I really was, not someone who needed their approval, but someone who'd earned the respect of people whose opinions actually mattered. The chapel doors opened, and my world changed forever. 10 minutes earlier, I'd felt utterly alone. Now, as the sound of synchronized footsteps echoed off the stone walls, I knew with absolute certainty that I was anything but alone. The mockery died immediately, replaced by something I'd never seen before in this room: genuine respect. They entered in perfect formation, 6 members of my team in their dress blues. Ribbons gleaming, shoes polished to mirror brightness, bearing the unmistakable presence that comes from years of training and combat experience. Master Chief Rodriguez led the formation, his weathered face impassive, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced awareness of someone who'd survived multiple deployments. Behind him came Petty Officer Martinez, our medic, who'd saved 3 lives during our last operation in Syria. Then Lieutenant Patterson, our communications specialist, followed by Chief Kowalski, Petty Officer Thompson, and, bringing up the rear, Lieutenant Chin, our demolitions expert. They moved as one unit, their steps perfectly synchronized, covering the distance from the chapel doors to my pew with the precision that had been drilled into them through thousands of hours of training. Every conversation in the room stopped. Every head turned. When they reached me, they formed a line on either side of my pew, 3 on my left, 3 on my right. Then Master Chief Rodriguez's voice rang out, clear and commanding, in the tone that had directed operations in some of the world's most dangerous places: "Commander on deck." The words hit the chapel like a physical force. Every member of my team snapped to attention simultaneously, their salute sharp and precise. The sound seemed to reverberate off the stone walls, filling every corner of the space with unmistakable military precision. I stood slowly, automatically returning their salute. Around us, the chapel had gone completely silent. The whispers, the mocking laughter, the casual dismissal, all of it evaporated in the face of what everyone was witnessing. Margaret Thornton's face had gone white. Thomas looked like he might be having a medical emergency. The friends who'd been so entertained by my apparent unworthiness sat frozen, suddenly understanding that they'd drastically miscalculated. Because this wasn't just ceremony or pageantry. This was 6 people who'd served under my command, who'd trusted my judgment in life-or-death situations, who'd followed me through hostile territory because they believed in my leadership. Their presence here, their willingness to travel across the country to honor my wedding, spoke louder than any argument I could have made about my worth. Master Chief Rodriguez stepped forward slightly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned his rank through decades of exemplary service. "Ma'am, the team wanted to be here for your wedding. We know how important this day is." I felt my throat tighten with emotion I hadn't expected. These were people who understood duty, honor, and loyalty, not as abstract concepts, but as lived principles. They'd seen me prove myself in ways that mattered, and they'd come to honor that shared history. "Thank you, Master Chief," I managed. "All of you. This means everything." The chapel remained silent except for the soft shuffle of people turning to stare. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes, all trying to process what they were seeing. The woman they'd dismissed as not worthy was clearly worthy enough that 6 elite military operators had traveled here specifically to honor her. Lieutenant Chin stepped forward. "Commander, we brought something for you." She handed me a small box, military challenge coins from our unit, engraved with the operation dates where we'd served together. It was the kind of gift that meant nothing to civilians and everything to people who understood what it represented: shared risk, mutual trust, and the bonds forged through serving together. I looked at each of their faces, people I'd led through training, through deployments, through situations where failure meant death. They looked back with the quiet pride of professionals who'd served under competent leadership and wanted to acknowledge that service publicly. "We should let the ceremony proceed," Master Chief Rodriguez said finally. "But we'll be here, ma'am. Wouldn't miss it." They moved to take seats in the pews behind me, their presence transforming the entire dynamic of the room. No longer was I the questionable woman who didn't fit the Thornton family standards. I was a military officer whose team had come to honor her, whose leadership had earned the kind of respect that couldn't be faked or bought. I looked across the aisle at Richard, who was staring at the scene with an expression I'd never seen before. Not surprise, he knew about my military service, knew about the people I'd served with. But perhaps he was seeing, for the first time, the concrete reality of what that service meant. Because it's one thing to know your fiancé is a SEAL officer. It's another thing entirely to watch 6 combat veterans travel across the country to salute her on her wedding day. The organist, after a moment of obvious confusion, began playing the processional again. But this time, as I walked down the aisle, I wasn't walking alone. I was walking as someone whose worth had been demonstrated beyond any doubt, whose leadership had been tested in the most demanding environments possible. The faces I passed were no longer smirking or dismissive. They were awed, uncertain, recalculating everything they thought they knew about me. Some looked embarrassed, they should be. Others looked impressed, finally understanding that they'd severely underestimated the woman walking toward the altar. But I wasn't walking for their approval anymore. I was walking toward a future with someone who, I hoped, finally understood exactly who he was marrying. Richard waited at the altar, his face a mixture of emotions I couldn't fully read. Pride, certainly. Love, I hoped. But also something else, perhaps the realization that our relationship was about to shift onto entirely different ground. The ceremony proceeded, but everything had changed. The words we spoke, the vows we made, the rings we exchanged, all of it happened in the context of what everyone had just witnessed. I wasn't just becoming Richard's wife. I was a military officer whose team had publicly honored her, whose leadership had been validated in front of everyone who'd questioned it. When the minister pronounced us married, Richard kissed me with a tenderness that felt different than before. Deeper. More respectful. As if he was kissing someone he was seeing clearly for the first time. As we walked back down the aisle, my team stood and saluted again. 6 people who'd served with distinction, honoring someone they'd trusted with their lives. The gesture was simple, traditional, but in this context it was revolutionary. Because respect, real respect, isn't something you can demand or debate. It's something you earn through demonstrated confidence, through making the right decisions when everything is on the line, through proving yourself worthy of trust when failure isn't an option. I'd spent months trying to convince the Thornton family of my worth through politeness and accommodation. My team had accomplished the same thing in 10 minutes, simply by showing up and acknowledging what I'd already proven. The receiving line after the ceremony was a study in social recalibration. People who'd been smugly dismissive an hour earlier now approached with uncertain respect, clearly unsure how to adjust their expectations. Margaret Thornton, particularly, seemed to be struggling with a complete revision of her assessment. "Your colleagues are very impressive," she said carefully, as if testing out new vocabulary. "They're my team," I corrected. "People I've had the honor to serve with." "Yes, of course." She paused, clearly out of her depth. "I hope you understand, we didn't realize. That is, we weren't fully aware of your position." It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and, frankly, closer than I'd expected. But it also revealed something important. Their dismissal of me hadn't been based on who I actually was, but on their incomplete understanding of what I'd accomplished. Richard appeared at my side, his hand finding mine. "Everything okay?" "Perfect," I said, and for the first time that day, I meant it completely. Because I'd learned something crucial in that chapel. I'd been fighting for acceptance from people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered to me. The people whose opinions did matter, my team, my sailors, the men and women who'd served under my command, had never questioned my worth. Master Chief Rodriguez approached as the receiving line was winding down. "Ma'am, we need to head back to base tonight. Early flight tomorrow." "I can't thank you enough for being here," I said. "This meant more than you know." "Ma'am," he said with the slight smile I'd learned to recognize as his version of deep satisfaction, "we've followed you through some pretty challenging situations. We weren't about to let you handle this one alone." As they prepared to leave, each member of my team took a moment to congratulate me personally. These were people who'd seen me at my worst, exhausted, frustrated, making difficult decisions under impossible pressure, and at my best, leading them through successful missions that had saved lives and accomplished critical objectives. Their respect wasn't based on my ability to fit into someone else's social expectations. It was based on competence, integrity, and the willingness to put the mission and the team before my own comfort or convenience. Lieutenant Patterson, our communications specialist, was the last to say goodbye. "Commander," she said quietly, "I hope your husband understands how lucky he is." I looked across the room at Richard, who was talking with my parents, his face animated in a way I hadn't seen around his own family. He caught my eye and smiled, not the careful, diplomatic smile he wore around his parents, but the genuine expression I'd fallen in love with. "I think he's starting to," I said. The reception was a different affair entirely. The power dynamic had shifted so fundamentally that conversations flowed along completely new channels. Instead of subtle condescension, I encountered genuine curiosity about my career, my experiences, my perspective on leadership and service. Richard's uncle, who'd barely acknowledged me at previous family gatherings, spent 20 minutes asking detailed questions about military strategy and the challenges of commanding people in high-stress situations. His aunt, who'd whispered about my intensity at Christmas dinner, wanted to know about the physical demands of SEAL training and how I'd managed to succeed in such a competitive environment. The transformation was remarkable, if somewhat depressing. These were the same people, having the same conversation with the same woman. The only thing that had changed was their understanding of my position and accomplishments. But that understanding, apparently, made all the difference in whether they saw me as worthy of basic respect. Richard found me during the dancing portion of the reception, pulling me aside to a quiet corner. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "For what?" "For not standing up to them earlier. For letting them treat you like that. I kept thinking they'd come around, that if I just gave them time." He shook his head. "I was wrong. And I should have protected you from their judgment." I studied his face, looking for the conflict I'd seen there during previous family interactions. It was gone. In its place was clarity and resolution that I'd never seen before when it came to his parents. "What changed?" I asked. "Watching your team today. Seeing the respect they have for you, understanding what that respect represents." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've known about your career, obviously. But I think I understood it intellectually without really grasping what it meant practically. Watching 6 combat veterans salute you, hearing the pride in their voices when they talked about serving under your command, it made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. And that matters to you? It matters because it's who you are. It's what you've accomplished. It's why they were wrong to question your worth, and why I was wrong not to defend it more forcefully." We danced to a song I'd never heard before, something his mother had chosen for its appropriateness rather than its meaning to us. But as we moved together, I felt something settle into place, a sense that we'd weathered our first real test as a married couple and emerged stronger. Because the chapel had shown us both something important. It had shown Richard who he'd married, not just the woman he loved, but the leader others respected and trusted. And it had shown me that my worth didn't depend on anyone's approval except my own and the people whose opinions were earned through shared service and mutual respect. The Thornton family would adjust, or they wouldn't. They'd find a way to incorporate me into their social framework, or they'd remain perpetually uncomfortable with my presence. Either way, it no longer mattered to me in the same way it had that morning. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Margaret approached me one final time. She looked older than she had that morning, as if the day's revelations had forced her to recalculate years of assumptions. "Josephine," she said, my name sounding strange in her voice. She'd rarely used it before, preferring generic terms like dear or simply avoiding direct address altogether. "I want you to know that Thomas and we hope you'll be patient with us as we learn more about your profession." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that their initial assessment had been incomplete and unfair. "Of course," I said. "Family takes time to understand each other." She nodded and moved away, but not before I caught something in her expression that looked almost like relief. Perhaps she'd been as uncomfortable with the antagonistic dynamic as I had been, but hadn't known how to change it without losing face. The months that followed were a study in adaptation and renegotiation. The Thorntons made a genuine effort to understand my career, asking questions about my responsibilities and showing interest in my deployments. They still didn't fully grasp the military culture I lived in, but they stopped treating it as something I'd eventually outgrow. More importantly, Richard found his voice when it came to defending our relationship and my place in the family. He began pushing back against subtle criticisms and casual dismissals, making it clear that disrespecting me meant disrespecting our marriage. "I married a military officer," he told his mother during one particularly tense family dinner. "Not despite her career, but including it. If you want a relationship with us, that means accepting all of who she is." The change wasn't immediate or complete, but it was real. Respect, I learned, sometimes has to be demanded as well as earned. And sometimes it takes a dramatic demonstration to shift entrenched patterns of thinking. Looking back on that day in the chapel, I realized it wasn't really about my in-laws at all. It was about understanding the difference between seeking approval and commanding respect. Approval is given or withheld by others, often based on factors beyond your control. Respect is earned through your actions and demonstrated through the trust of people whose opinions matter. My team understood that distinction instinctively. They'd never questioned whether I was worthy. They'd evaluated my competence, trusted my judgment, and given me their loyalty because I'd proven myself capable of leading them effectively. The chapel moment became a turning point, but not because it changed who I was. It changed how others saw me, yes, but more importantly, it reminded me of who I'd always been, someone whose worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. Years later, when young officers ask me about balancing military service with family relationships, I tell them about that wedding day. About the importance of knowing your own value, about choosing battles that actually matter, and about the difference between proving yourself to people who matter and wasting energy on those who don't. Because real strength isn't about convincing others of your worth. It's about living a life where your worth is undeniable, where respect is earned through competence and integrity, and where the opinions that matter most come from people who've seen you at your best and worst and chosen to stand beside you anyway. The sound of boots in that chapel didn't make me worthy. I already was. It just made that truth impossible to ignore. But that wasn't the end of the story. If anything, it was the beginning of understanding what marriage actually meant when both people finally saw each other clearly. The honeymoon in Italy gave us space to process what had happened. Richard had chosen a small coastal town in Cinque Terre, far enough from tourist crowds that we could walk for hours without seeing anyone we knew. On our third day there, as we sat on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, he finally voiced what had been building between us since the chapel. "I've been thinking about what Master Chief Rodriguez said to you," he began, watching waves crash against the rocks below. "About following you through challenging situations." "What about it?" "I want to know about those situations. Not the classified details, but what it was like. What you went through to earn that kind of loyalty." So I told him. Not everything. Some experiences don't translate into words, and others remain classified, but enough. I told him about the first time I had to make a life-or-death decision for my team, about the weight of knowing that 6 people's survival depended on my judgment. I told him about the sailor who died during my second deployment, how I'd replayed that mission for months afterward, analyzing every decision that led to that outcome. His name was Petty Officer Martinez, I said, surprised by how easily his name came. Different Martinez than the one at our wedding. This one was 23 from Phoenix. He had a daughter he'd never met. His girlfriend was pregnant when we deployed. Richard waited, sensing there was more. We were extracting a high-value asset from a compound in Afghanistan. Everything went according to plan until it didn't. Martinez took shrapnel from an IED that shouldn't have been there, in a location our intelligence said was clear. I paused, watching a fishing boat navigate the swells below us. He died in the helicopter before we could get him to the hospital. I'm sorry. The thing is, I continued, I could have made different choices. Could have sent him in a different direction, could have delayed the mission another day for better intelligence. For months afterward, I questioned every decision I'd made. What changed? My commanding officer pulled me aside after Martinez's memorial service. He said something I'll never forget. The burden of command isn't that you might make the wrong decision. It's that you have to make decisions at all, knowing that people's lives depend on them. That's why not everyone can do this job. Richard was quiet for a long time. Then, is that why your team respects you so much? Because you carry that weight? Partly. But more because they know I'll never ask them to do something I wouldn't do myself. And because when things go wrong, which they always do, I take responsibility instead of looking for someone else to blame. We spent the rest of our honeymoon talking about things we'd never discussed before. He told me about cases he'd lost, about clients he'd failed to save from prison sentences he believed were unjust. I told him about missions that succeeded beyond expectations, about sailors who'd grown from inexperienced recruits into skilled operators under my command. By the time we returned home, something fundamental had shifted between us. Richard wasn't just married to a woman who happened to be in the military. He was married to a leader whose decisions had life-and-death consequences, whose professional identity was inseparable from who she was as a person. That understanding was tested sooner than either of us expected. 3 months after our wedding, I received orders for a 6-month deployment to the Persian Gulf. It wasn't unexpected. SEAL officers deploy regularly, but it was our first major separation as a married couple. The night before I left, we had dinner at his parents' house. The dynamic was still evolving from the chapel revelation, and Margaret made a visible effort to engage with me about my upcoming deployment. "How long will you be gone?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. 6 months, approximately. Could be shorter if the mission parameters change. And Richard will be here alone? There it was, the subtle implication that I was abandoning my husband, that a proper wife wouldn't leave for such extended periods. Before I could respond, Richard spoke up. "Josephine's serving our country, Mom. Her deployment schedule isn't something she controls, and it's not something I resent. It's part of who she is." Margaret blinked, clearly surprised by his directness. "Of course, dear. I just meant, it must be difficult for both of you." "It is difficult," I said. "But it's also necessary. My team depends on my leadership, and I have a responsibility to them and to the mission." Thomas, who'd been mostly silent throughout dinner, finally spoke. "What exactly will you be doing over there?" "I can't discuss operational details, but we'll be supporting special operations throughout the region." "Dangerous work?" "All military work involves risk. But we train extensively to minimize that risk and complete our missions successfully." He nodded slowly, and I realized this might be the first time he'd actually thought of me as someone whose job involved genuine danger rather than just inconvenient travel. The deployment was routine by SEAL standards, but it gave me perspective on my marriage that I couldn't have gained otherwise. Being away from Richard for extended periods, communicating only through sporadic emails and brief phone calls, forced us both to examine what we'd built together. His emails revealed a man grappling with the reality of being married to someone whose first loyalty had to be to her mission and her team. Not because she loved them more, but because lives depended on that priority. "I miss you," he wrote in one message, "but I'm also proud of what you're doing." Mrs. Henderson next door asked me if I was lonely with my wife, playing soldier overseas. I told her my wife isn't playing anything. She's leading a team of highly trained operators in missions that keep people like Mrs. Henderson safe in their beds at night. I stared at that email for a long time, sitting in my quarters on a forward operating base somewhere in the Gulf. Richard was learning to articulate not just his love for me, but his understanding of what that love required from him. My emails back to him were necessarily limited. Operational security meant I couldn't discuss most of what I was doing, but I tried to share what I could about leadership. About the satisfaction of working with a team that functioned at the highest levels of competence and trust. "Master Chief Rodriguez pulled me aside yesterday," I wrote. "He said the new guys are responding well to my leadership style. Coming from him, that's high praise. He's served under commanders for 15 years, and he doesn't give compliments lightly." What I didn't tell Richard was how much I'd grown to appreciate having a marriage that could survive these separations. Many military relationships don't. The demands of the service, the long deployments, the constant uncertainty create pressure that breaks couples apart. But our relationship was different now. Richard understood that my commitment to the mission wasn't about choosing my career over our marriage. It was about being the person he'd fallen in love with, someone who took responsibility seriously, who led by example, who couldn't abandon her team any more than she could abandon him. The homecoming was different too. Previous returns from training exercises or short deployments had been purely personal celebrations. This time, Richard met me at the base, but he also attended the unit's welcome home ceremony. He watched as families reunited, as children ran to parents they hadn't seen for months, as spouses embraced after long separations. "I never really understood the community aspect of military life," he said afterward. "Seeing all those families, understanding that everyone makes these sacrifices together, it's bigger than I realized." He was learning something important. Military service isn't just an individual choice. It's a commitment that affects entire families, entire communities. The support systems that make it possible are built on shared understanding and mutual respect. That understanding deepened over the following year. Richard began attending unit social events, not as the reluctant civilian spouse, but as someone genuinely interested in the people I served with. He developed friendships with other military spouses, learning from their experiences and perspectives. More importantly, he learned to explain my career to people who didn't understand it. When his law partners asked about my frequent absences, he didn't apologize or make excuses. He explained that I led a team of elite operators whose training and readiness were critical to national security. "Josephine's not just in the military," I heard him tell a colleague at a firm party. "She's a SEAL officer. That means she's one of maybe 100 women in the world who've completed that training and earned that position. When she's deployed, she's leading missions that matter." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and it represented a complete transformation from the man who'd stayed silent while his family questioned my worth. But the real test of our marriage came 18 months later, when I received an offer that would change everything. My commanding officer called me into his office on a Tuesday morning in March. Captain Williams was a career SEAL officer with 22 years of service, someone whose judgment I'd learned to trust completely. "Josephine," he said without preamble, "how do you feel about Virginia?" "Sir, Naval Special Warfare Command is looking for a new executive officer. Your name came up during the selection process." I felt my breath catch. Executive Officer of NSW Command was a position typically reserved for officers with significantly more experience than I had. It was a career-defining opportunity, but it would also mean leaving my team, leaving San Diego, and asking Richard to uproot his entire legal practice. "Sir, I'm honored to be considered, but before you say anything," he interrupted, "let me give you some context. This isn't just about your operational record, though that's impressive. It's about your leadership style, your ability to integrate with joint forces, and your understanding of how special operations fits into broader strategic objectives." He handed me a folder. "This is the position description. Take it home, discuss it with your husband, and give me an answer by Friday." That night, I sat at our kitchen table with the folder unopened, trying to figure out how to explain to Richard that our life might be about to change dramatically. He found me there an hour later, still staring at the folder. "Bad news or good news?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet." I explained the opportunity, watching his face carefully for signs of resentment or reluctance. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected: excitement. "This is a big deal, isn't it?" he said. "It's a huge deal. But it would mean moving to Virginia, starting over professionally for both of us." "What do you want to do?" The question surprised me. For months, I'd been bracing for conversations about how my career affected his life, how my choices limited his options. But Richard was asking what I wanted, as if my aspirations mattered independent of their impact on him. "I want to take it," I said honestly. "This kind of position, it's what I've been working toward my entire career. The chance to influence policy, to shape how special operations integrates with conventional forces, to mentor the next generation of SEAL officers. Then we'll make it work." "Richard, this isn't a small adjustment. You'd have to rebuild your client base, establish new professional relationships." "Josephine," he interrupted, "do you remember what you told me during our honeymoon? About Petty Officer Martinez?" I nodded. You said the burden of command is having to make decisions knowing that people's lives depend on them. This position, it sounds like the decisions you'd make would affect not just your immediate team, but the entire special operations community. They would. Then we're moving to Virginia. The transition was more difficult than either of us anticipated. Richard had to take the Virginia bar exam, establish new professional relationships, and build a client base from scratch. I had to adapt to a role that was more administrative than operational, focused on policy and strategic planning rather than direct leadership of small teams. But we navigated it together, and the experience taught us something crucial about our marriage. We could support each other's professional growth without compromising our individual identities. Richard's law practice in Virginia specialized in military family law, helping service members navigate complex legal issues related to deployment, family separation, and veterans' benefits. His clients were people who understood the demands of military life firsthand, and his personal experience as a military spouse gave him credibility and insight that other attorneys couldn't match. I never thought I'd find my legal work more meaningful in Virginia than it was in San Diego, he told me one evening. But helping military families navigate the system, it feels like I'm contributing to something larger than individual cases. My role at NSW Command was equally fulfilling, but in different ways. Instead of leading 6 people on specific missions, I was helping shape policy that would affect thousands of special operations personnel across all service branches. The decisions I made about training standards, operational procedures, and equipment procurement would influence the effectiveness and safety of SEAL teams worldwide. The work was demanding and sometimes frustrating. Bureaucracy moved slower than operational tempo, but it was also deeply satisfying. I was using everything I'd learned as a team leader to improve the system that developed and supported other team leaders. 3 years into the Virginia assignment, I received a phone call that brought our journey full circle. Commander, Master Chief Rodriguez's voice was unmistakable, even over a poor connection. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Never, Master Chief. Where are you? Still in San Diego, but not for long. I'm retiring next month after 22 years. Congratulations. What's next? That's why I'm calling. I've been offered a position with a defense contractor, training international special operations units. Good money, interesting work, chance to travel. But before I accept, I wanted to run something by you. He paused, and I could picture him choosing his words carefully, the way he always did before making important points. The thing is, ma'am, working under your command was the highlight of my career. You taught me things about leadership that I'd never learned in 20 years of service. If you ever decide to leave the Navy and start your own consulting firm, I'd like to be your first hire. I was quiet for a moment, touched by his words and the loyalty they represented. I appreciate that more than you know, Master Chief. I'm not ready to leave the Navy yet, but if I ever do decide to transition to the private sector, I'll call you first. Outstanding, ma'am. Oh, and Commander? Mr. Thornton called me last week. Richard called you? Yes, ma'am. He's planning some kind of surprise for your promotion ceremony, and he wanted to coordinate with the team. I can't give you details, but I think you'll be pleased. Richard's surprise revealed itself 2 weeks later, when I was promoted to commander in a ceremony at NSW Command Headquarters. The promotion itself was significant. Commander is a major milestone in any naval officer's career, but what made it special was who Richard had arranged to be there. Not just my current colleagues and superiors, but representatives from every unit I'd served with throughout my career. Master Chief Rodriguez had flown in from San Diego. Lieutenant Chin came from her new assignment in Hawaii. Even some of the sailors I'd led during my first deployment made the trip to Virginia. But the real surprise was seeing Margaret and Thomas Thornton in the audience, sitting next to my parents and looking genuinely proud to be there. After the ceremony, during the reception, Margaret approached me with tears in her eyes. Josephine, I owe you an apology that's about 4 years overdue. Mrs. Thornton, that's not necessary. It is necessary, she interrupted. I judged you based on ignorance and prejudice, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you. Watching this ceremony today, hearing those officers talk about your leadership and your service, I finally understand what Richard saw in you from the beginning. She paused, composing herself. You're not just worthy of our son. Our son is lucky to have you. It was the apology I'd never expected to receive, and it meant more to me than I'd thought it would. Not because I needed her approval. I'd learned years ago that my worth didn't depend on her opinion, but because it represented growth, the ability to admit error and change perspective. Thomas was less eloquent, but no less sincere. I never served, he said simply. I didn't understand what that meant, what it required. I do now. The promotion ceremony became a celebration not just of my career advancement, but of the family we'd all learned to become. Complicated, sometimes difficult, but ultimately supportive of each other's growth and success. That evening, as Richard and I cleaned up after the reception, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. Do you ever think about that day in the chapel? I asked. Often, he said. It was the day I finally understood who I'd married. And now? Now I understand that marriage isn't about finding someone who fits perfectly into your existing life. It's about growing together into people who can support each other's dreams and ambitions, even when those dreams require sacrifice and change. He was right. The woman who'd sat in that chapel pew, humiliated by her in-laws' dismissal, had been fighting the wrong battle entirely. She'd been seeking acceptance from people whose opinions didn't matter, instead of focusing on building a life with someone whose opinion did. The sound of boots that day hadn't changed who I was, it had simply made my worth impossible to ignore. But the real transformation had happened in the years that followed, as Richard and I learned what it meant to be married to each other, not to idealized versions of who we thought we should be. Military service teaches you that respect is earned through demonstrated competence, that trust is built through shared sacrifice, and that real strength comes from serving something larger than yourself. But marriage taught me something equally important, that love is a choice you make every day, not just in moments of crisis, but in the mundane decisions about whose dreams you'll support and whose growth you'll celebrate. As I looked around our Virginia home, filled with mementos from both our careers, his law awards displayed next to my military decorations, photos from his legal victories alongside pictures of my SEAL teams, I realized we'd built something neither of us could have imagined when we first met in that coffee shop near the base. As I looked around our Virginia home, filled with mementos from both our careers, his law awards displayed next to my military decorations, photos from his legal victories alongside pictures of my SEAL teams, I realized we'd built something neither of us could have imagined when we first met in that coffee shop near the base. We'd built a partnership based on mutual respect, shared sacrifice, and the understanding that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that help you become who you're meant to be. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations, and our next challenge came from an unexpected direction. 2 months after my promotion ceremony, I received a call that would force us to confront the ultimate question of sacrifice and service. It was Captain Williams, now serving as Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, and his voice carried the weight of something significant. "Josephine, I need to see you in my office tomorrow morning. There's an opportunity I want to discuss with you, but it's not one we can talk about over unsecured lines." The next morning, I sat across from Captain Williams in his Pentagon office, reading through classified documents that outlined a joint training initiative with Allied Special Forces. The program would establish permanent training facilities in 3 different countries, with rotating commands responsible for developing standardized procedures across international special operations units. "This is groundbreaking work," I said, looking up from the briefing materials. "It is. And we want you to lead the program." I felt that familiar flutter of excitement and apprehension that came with significant opportunities. What would that involve? 3-year assignment. First year in Norway, establishing the Nordic training protocols. Second year in Australia, developing Pacific region procedures. Third year in Germany, integrating European Special Forces standards. And after that? After that, you'd likely be in line for your own command. Potentially NSW Group 2 or 3, depending on what opens up. I sat back in my chair, trying to process what he was offering. Command of a special warfare group was the pinnacle of a SEAL officer's career, the kind of position that came with significant responsibility and the authority to shape the future of special operations. But it would also mean 3 years of constant travel, minimal contact with home, and asking Richard to manage our relationship across continents and time zones. Sir, this is an incredible opportunity, but I need to discuss it with my husband. Of course. Take a week to think it over. But Josephine, he leaned forward, opportunities like this don't come along often. This program will define how international special operations cooperation evolves over the next decade. The officer who leads it will have influence far beyond their rank or traditional authority. That evening, I found myself in the familiar position of sitting at our kitchen table, trying to figure out how to explain to Richard that our life might change dramatically once again. But this time felt different. This wasn't about relocating to a new city. This was about spending 3 years essentially living apart. Richard came home from court to find me still sitting there, the classified briefing folder secured in my study, but my conflicted thoughts written clearly on my face. Another big decision, he asked, settling into the chair across from me. The biggest one yet. I explained what I could about the opportunity, watching his expression carefully. I saw excitement for me, pride in my selection for such a significant role, and, underneath it all, the dawning realization of what this would mean for us. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years. With maybe a few weeks home between assignments, and limited communication during active training periods. And if you don't take it? If I don't take it, I'll likely continue in policy roles for the rest of my career. Important work, but not this level of impact. Richard was quiet for a long time, and I could see him working through the implications. We'd built such a strong foundation over the past few years, learned to support each other's professional growth, created a home that reflected both our achievements. Now I was asking him to put that on hold for 3 years while I pursued what might be the most significant opportunity of my career. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I want to take it, I said honestly. But I also want our marriage. And I'm not sure I can have both. Why not? Richard, 3 years is a long time. 3 years of brief phone calls, sporadic emails, maybe seeing each other for a week every 6 months. That's not a marriage, that's a long-distance friendship with shared finances. He smiled at that, but his expression remained thoughtful. Do you remember what you told me about Petty Officer Martinez? About the burden of command. Of course. You said the burden isn't that you might make the wrong decision, it's that you have to make decisions at all, knowing that people's lives depend on them. He reached across the table to take my hand. This program you'd be leading, it sounds like it would affect how special operations units work together internationally. That could save lives, couldn't it? It could. Better coordination, standardized procedures, improved communication between allied forces, yes, it could definitely save lives. Then you have to take it. I stared at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Just like that. Just like that. He squeezed my hand. Josephine, I married a SEAL officer. That means I married someone who puts mission and service above personal comfort. If I try to hold you back from this opportunity because I wanted you closer to home, I'd be asking you to be someone other than who you are. But what about us? What about our marriage? Our marriage will survive 3 years. We've already proven we can handle deployments, separations, and major life changes. This is just a bigger version of challenges we've already faced. What will you do? I can't ask you to put your career on hold for 3 years. I've been thinking about that since you started explaining the opportunity, he said. Remember that defense contractor position Master Chief Rodriguez mentioned? There are several firms doing international work, providing legal support for military contractors and joint operations. I could probably find consulting work that would let me travel, maybe even coordinate some visits when you're between training cycles. The idea was so thoroughly thought out that I realized he'd been preparing for this possibility longer than I had. You've been expecting something like this, I said. I've been expecting your career to present opportunities that would require sacrifices from both of us. That's what happens when you're married to someone whose work matters at the strategic level. Over the following week, we talked through every aspect of what the assignment would mean. Richard researched international legal consulting firms, reaching out to contacts from his military family law practice who'd transitioned to defense contracting. I spoke with other officers who'd handled similar long-term international assignments, learning about communication strategies and relationship management across time zones and deployments. But the conversation that sealed my decision came from an unexpected source, Margaret Thornton. She called on a Thursday evening, asking if she could take me to lunch the following day. It was unusual. We developed a cordial relationship since my promotion ceremony, but we weren't in the habit of one-on-one meetings. We met at a quiet restaurant in Arlington, and after the usual pleasantries about Richard's work and my duties at NSW Command, she got to the point. "Richard told me about your opportunity," she said. "The International Training Program." I was surprised he discussed it with her, but I nodded. It's a significant career opportunity, but it would mean extensive travel and separation. He also told me you're considering turning it down because of the impact on your marriage. It's a factor in my decision, yes. Margaret was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea with the careful precision I'd learned to recognize as her way of organizing her thoughts. "Josephine, I owe you an honest conversation. When Richard first told us he was serious about you, Thomas and I were concerned. Not because of your background or your career, though I'll admit those were factors we didn't initially understand. We were concerned because we could see how much he loved you, and we worried about what would happen if he had to choose between that love and the demands of your profession." She looked up at me, her expression more direct than I'd ever seen it. "What we didn't understand then, what that day in the chapel taught us, is that supporting your career isn't something Richard has to do despite loving you. It's how he expresses that love. By encouraging you to pursue opportunities that utilize your talents and serve something larger than individual ambition." I felt an unexpected tightness in my throat at her words. "If you turn down this assignment because you're worried about Richard, you'll be making the same mistake we made 4 years ago, underestimating his understanding of who you are and what your service means." "Mrs. Thornton, Margaret," she corrected gently. "And I'm not finished. Thomas and I have been married for 32 years. We've learned that the strongest marriages aren't built on staying in the same place, they're built on growing together, even when that growth requires temporary separation." She reached across the table to touch my hand briefly. "Take the assignment, Josephine. Richard will be fine. Your marriage will be fine. And you'll be serving your country and your profession at the highest level. That's who you are, and that's who Richard fell in love with." I accepted the assignment the following Monday. The farewell dinner that Richard organized 3 weeks before my departure to Norway was unlike anything I could have imagined. He'd rented a private dining room at a restaurant in downtown DC. And when I walked in, I found myself surrounded by people from every phase of my military career. Master Chief Rodriguez had flown in from his new civilian job in San Diego. Lieutenant Chin was there from Hawaii, along with Petty Officer Martinez from my current deployment rotation. Captain Williams attended, along with other officers from NSW Command. But what surprised me most was seeing my parents sitting next to Margaret and Thomas, all of them clearly comfortable in each other's company. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked Richard. "Since the day you accepted the assignment. I wanted you to start this new chapter knowing exactly how many people believe in your leadership and support your service." The dinner was filled with stories from different phases of my career, shared memories of challenging missions and successful operations. But what struck me most was how naturally the conversation flowed between military and civilian attendees. Richard had somehow created an environment where my parents could understand the significance of my professional relationships, where his parents could see the depth of respect I'd earned from my peers. During dessert, Master Chief Rodriguez stood to make a toast. In 22 years of military service, I served under a lot of officers. Some were confident, some were inspiring, and a few were both. He raised his glass toward me. "Commander Thornton is the only officer I ever served under who made me a better leader, not just a better follower. This international assignment, it's not just an opportunity for her career advancement. It's an opportunity for every special operations unit that will benefit from the standards and procedures she develops." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, but what meant the most to me was seeing Richard's face during the toast. He looked proud, certainly, but more than that, he looked like a man who understood exactly what he'd committed to when he married me. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself talking quietly with Margaret near the restaurant's entrance. "Thank you for what you said at lunch last month," I told her. "It helped me make the right decision." "I should have said it years ago," she replied. "But I'm glad I finally understood it in time to be helpful." "Understood what?" "That real love means wanting someone to become their best self, even when their best self requires sacrifice from you too." 3 days later, I boarded a military transport to Norway, beginning what would become the most challenging and rewarding assignment of my career. But as the plane lifted off, I carried with me the certainty that I wasn't leaving my marriage behind. I was expanding it to encompass a larger definition of service and support than either Richard or I had originally imagined possible. And that's how a moment meant to break me turned into one that defined me. Respect isn't something you beg for, it's something you earn, and the right people will always see it. Have you ever been underestimated or dismissed by someone close to you, only to prove them wrong? How did you handle it? Would you have confronted them or let your actions speak louder? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories about standing tall when others try to cut you down.